Hi, everybody. Hi, this is Dan Chun, co-founder of Hawaiian Islands Ministries, or HIM for short, and welcome to the HIM podcast, where we interview people from all over the world who will be interesting, they're remarkable, they're amazing, and they'll help us in our own life personally, or maybe in our ministry or in our business. And so today we have somebody who'll be really great, because you know what? All of us have a boss, and that can make things good or hard in life. And all of us, and many of us, are bosses. We are managers or leaders or supervisors. And so we're going to talk about leadership today. We're also going to talk about what makes a good leader. And we're going to talk about how we can avoid choosing bad leaders. And so very practical. And we have with us today an amazing person. We have Dr. Kathryn Scanland coming in from Chicago. So aloha, Kathryn.
Aloha, Dan.
So great to have you with us. So everybody, let me tell you a little bit about Kathryn, and so you know why she is with us. She is a coach, a executive search firm. She's a professor. She's a process consultant, and she has had more than 25 years of professional experience with more than 100 organizations in strategic planning, in helping to find leaders, in change management, and executive coaching. And so I want to tell you a little bit of background of her education and some of her customers. First of all, she has a doctorate in management and organizational leadership. She has an MBA, and she has a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration. And she's certified. She's a certified professional coach, and an Enneagram practitioner, and an emotional intelligence practitioner, and she's a certified trainer for everything DISC, and certified trainer for the 5 behaviors of a cohesive team, and a certified trainer for Franklin Covey's 5 choices to extraordinary productivity. And I love Covey in so many different ways. Just so you know, she is also the chairman of the board for Baker Publishing Group, which is the largest independent publishing company in America. And she has worked with David C. Cook and Group Publishing, Tyndale, and Christianity Today International. And she's worked with other nonprofits nonprofits like BioLogos, and she's done Moody Bible Institute and the Christian Reformed Church of North America, Calvary Church, American Institute of Architects, and a lot of universities like Notre Dame and Wheaton and University of Alabama, Birmingham, and University of Michigan, Flint, and Washington University, St. Louis, which is a great university. And on the secular side, she's helped in leadership with Amway and Bosch. So that's the dishwasher, oven, refrigerator people, and ServiceMaster. And so she's had a great deal of experience. And most importantly, she worked for Advocates for Urban Agriculture, so let's hear it for the environment, and Bread Bakers Guild of America. So Jesus says, I'm the bread of life. So this is so cool, Kathryn. You've helped out there. I should say, in full transparency, that she's also right now searching for the leader for Hawaiian Islands Ministries, the new executive director. As you know, co-founder Pam, my wife, and I are stepping back from leadership, but we'll still hang around for 6 months to a year or wherever long it takes to find the new leader. So that's great. She's also connected to Hawaii because she's looking for the new executive director for the River of Life mission, which if you're on the mainland, that's a ministry that helps the homeless, the disenfranchised, and helps them get off the streets and housing or back with their family on the mainland or here in Hawaii. So, oh my, wasn't that a great bio, Kathryn? You sound like a Marvel hero. So,
We'll see what I can live up to, Dan.
yeah, well, so we're glad him and River of Life has chosen you, and I am on the board of River of Life too, everybody, just so full transparency. So this is a time, and we know even recently, there's been a lot of discussion about leadership, and some have not worked out well, and there's been awful infidelity or some moral issues, and some organizations are flourishing. So just to start off, you, in your relationship with him right now and River of Life, you're helping us define an executive, and we can talk more specifically about what him needs later. But What are some of the criteria that you look for in a leader that will have a long, sustainable career in ministry?
Yeah, well, ministry's going to be a little bit different, but I tend to always start with a definition of leadership I learned, I don't know how many decades ago, that has always really sort of stuck with me. And it is from the author Warren Bennis, and he said that a leader is a fully integrated human being. And I know that probably sounds a little strange to some people. What does that actually mean? And I think, especially in a ministry, it makes it a little bit easier for me to kind of describe it. In a ministry, it's someone who has really developed themselves as a leader, but also has spent a significant amount of time focused on their own spiritual development and spiritual formation. So it's a lot of dichotomous sort of attributes that they can hold at the same time, being that sort of fully integrated human being. One other attribute that I talk about a lot when I talk about leaders is they can hold two things at the very same time, and the two things they really need to hold amongst a list of other things, but this is the one that always comes to the top for me, is they can be very, I'll say, task-oriented, they can get things done, but they're also very relational. And it's not that they're in the middle, a little bit of each at the same time. It's that they can be strong on both ends of that spectrum at the same time. And that's a really hard thing to do because we tend to just naturally, intuitively lean toward one end or the other. But those people who can really lead are doing both of those things at the same time. Just like someone in ministry, they're great as a leader and leadership development, but who they are spiritually has been just as developed, if not maybe even a little bit more so. And they can hold both of those at the same time. So those are things that immediately come to mind for me.
Wow. I think back in college we would call that a dialectical tension. So that's so great. Now, would you add a third leg to the stool or a third wheel to the tricycle? Get things done, great relationally, but where does the visionary part, entrepreneurial part come for a leader?
That is becoming, I think, more and more important to have that vision. And part of the reason is because we live in a world that changes so rapidly. You almost have to watch the news twice a day to keep up on what has changed. And in order for a leader to really be maneuvering in that and bringing people along with them, they have to constantly have a vision. And that vision doesn't need to constantly change along with the change, but how you get to that vision might need to constantly adapt in the midst of all of the change. And if you aren't visionary, then it just becomes chaos with all of the change. But if you know where you're going and you kind of stay focused on that, and they're really clear about how to communicate that, then they can lead people through change. And I think that is one of the most challenging things. So absolutely being visionary. And I've had people actually remember someone specific once walked into an interview for a CEO position and just immediately said, I'm just going to tell you, I'm not a visionary and I don't have a vision. But I can get other people. I'm going to collaborate with the rest of my leadership team, and then we will create a vision. And I just have to say that doesn't work, because those people on that leadership team are still going to look to that leader, that CEO, and say, well, let's start with your vision. You simply can't get away from it, even though I know people have tried to. So if you can't come up with a vision, you may not be ready to lead, especially in today's environment.
Wow. And when you say especially in today's environment, would you say the pace of change and the need for pivoting is faster and more frequent than ever for a leader?
Absolutely. Yes,
Wow.
it is.
Well, that's extremely challenging then.
It is. It is. And it's, another example of, I have an individual I've been working with. She is a CEO, and I've been coaching her as a CEO, so I wasn't part of her transition into that role. But her organization really, truly needs to pivot. And they need to pivot quickly. It's a nonprofit, but it's her board who just cannot get themselves to allow that to happen. They start to move in that direction, and then they get cold feet, and suddenly it's almost like, and I've watched it, it's almost like whiplash. They just come right back to, no, we don't want to change. But they do want different outcomes, but they don't want anything to change. And it becomes very difficult because she's tried to present a vision and they're just not ready to make that change. And so unfortunately it's just not working.
So you coach individuals, and you're into process consulting, as you
Mhm.
call it. I'm assuming that includes boards, not just with individuals.
Right.
So what you just said, I'm sure echoes not only in the business world, but in the ministry world with church boards. I mean, when I've talked to
Mhm.
church boards, we want to change, we want new evangelism, we'll do anything to get young adults. And then when you say, oh, that means we're bringing in a band and we're not using the organ. Oh, whoa, wait a minute. We
Yeah.
want young adults, but we still want. So, I mean,
Right.
and in the secular world, same thing, as you mentioned.
Right.
How do you coach a board, and in ministry talk, elders or deacons or whatever they're
Mhm.
called, the trustees, deacons, how do you coach them to say, hey, gang, if you want change, this is what you have to do to kind of change your attitude to be receptive, or else you're setting up your leader for failure?
Right. Yeah, one thing I quote quite frequently is I will say, we want things to change, but we don't want anything to be different. And and that's so true in so many cases. And probably the one thing that I've coached people on the most is to let go of needing 100% agreement before you decide to make a change. And I think especially in a church, and I've been on a church board, and I've been the chair of a church board with some really difficult decisions. And we just couldn't wait for 100% of the board to all be there. We had to make a decision and make a change with maybe 90% and be okay with that. And I think that, especially with church boards, is one of the most difficult, is feeling like we have to get everyone 100% on board before we can make a change.
Is that because many board members are people pleasers? And they go, oh, no, Auntie Ruth is upset about this. We can't make a change because of one person.
I don't, for me in church boards, it's not so much people pleasing. For some reason, we feel like it's the Christian thing to do. As Christians, we should all be in agreement before we move forward on something. So I think somehow we're confusing what it means to share our faith with what it means to make a collaborative decision.
Wow, and think of the reverse in the Bible. When the 12 spies came back to make the report to Moses, we can take the promised land. It's 3 days away. 10 of them said no. Joshua and Caleb said yes. And in that case, the minority was right. And because Moses didn't listen to the minority, they're in the wilderness for 40 years.
Yeah.
That's really sad. How do you feel? David Hubbard, former late wonderful Fuller Seminary president, once said to me, whenever you delegate to someone, so this would include picking a new leader, whenever you delegate to someone, the most it will be of how you would want it to have done is 75%. And just go into it, that at least 25%, you're not going to like how that person made decisions or did it the style how you would have wanted. No more than 75%. Do you think that's helpful to tell boards that now that you've chosen a new leader, give him or her some freedom?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Give them some freedom, and not only that, but one of my other quotes that I now say a whole lot is, especially when you're selecting the next leader, it's make a decision and then make it right. So it's not going to be the perfect person. It never is. But then for the next several years, it's the work of the board to help turn it into the right decision. So you don't just pick an individual and walk away, that, your work as a board is done. Your work as a board has only just begun when you have picked the individual. It doesn't end at the announcement. It only begins at the announcement.
But that's an interesting tension, isn't it? The board sets the vision, and of course they can hire and fire the CEO. They decide the budget. But there's a fine line when boards get into the day-to-day operations, isn't
Right.
there?
Hmm.
And so how do you coach them on that? How they can nurture, but not be too picayune of saying, hey, you can't do this, you can't do that. You should have sent out more
Right.
letters, because that's getting really into the weeds, isn't it?
Right. Right. You have to support, you hired a leader, so you need to support them as a leader. You didn't hire an administrative assistant for the board. You hired someone to lead the organization and, in a sense, almost including the board as well. So you need to give them the space and allow them to do that. And you need to allow them the space to make mistakes. They're going to suggest some things that probably aren't going to work. Some things are probably going to be a bad idea. And that would be true for any of us walking into a leadership role. None of us are going to be perfect, but we have to have the space to experiment and to learn, and give them the space to do that. Give them the space to actually lead and support them.
Is there kind of a secret sauce that you've discovered now that maybe other search firms don't look for, but you've said, this is one thing that we really need to press and look for, that maybe other people miss, maybe the boards miss? Is there some aspect or character part that you really look for?
What I look for is, it's kind of a phrase that's being used a lot, I have found recently, and that is, especially if it's a Christian organization, I want to make sure that their character, or that, excuse me, that their platform has not gotten ahead of their character. And really looking at their character and what, it's not even necessarily a bad character, but what character does this particular organization really need in order for that leader to really thrive? So sometimes people will get a little too hung up on what is their experience, what have they done, what have they accomplished, how much money have they raised. And it's not that those things should not be looked at or addressed, but at the end of the day, it's probably their character and who they are that matters more than what they can do. Because that's so much more of what leadership is really about, is who you are as an individual, that people will follow you. And not overlooking that, especially in an interview, of getting too hung up on all the questions around what they accomplished and what they have done, but really trying to ask creative questions to find out who really are they as a person and what really is their character.
And just to make sure I understand, when you say platform, do you mean their policy or their performance goals, or what did you mean by platform?
I'm using platform in the way that platform is used, especially in the social media world. So it's more about how many hits are they getting, how many requests are they getting for speaking at different places, how are they building their notoriety. It's how big is their platform getting, and sometimes, not sometimes, but quite frequently, when the platform gets way ahead of the character, that's when things go wrong.
So here's the big question, Kathryn. How does one truly detect one's character? And I can't remember, was it Carl Rogers or Carl Jung who talked about the iceberg, where we only see people in the top of the iceberg, the visible part, and most of how people really are below the water, right? Because icebergs are mainly ice under the water. And that's the big thing. I mean, as we look at pastors, priests, CEOs who have, what we would say, fallen from grace, had a moral indiscretion or some kind of infidelity, and we get surprised, like, I never thought Pastor so-and-so would do that, or President so-and-so would do that. I know you're not a biblical prophet, or maybe you are, but how do you get an injection for that, a shot, so you have some antibodies that we pick the right person? So I know that's a difficult question, but
It is.
how can you kind of ping somebody to figure out truly what their character is like?
A couple of things. One is, that's why I think it is good to have an external consultant helping you along the way, because it's hopefully an outside, more objective perspective. Because especially if it's someone that you even only faintly sort of know, sometimes you're a little bit more leaning toward that individual a little more positively because you know them. And sometimes it takes someone who doesn't know them to see things in a little bit different light. And I think what I've seen some people do also in an interview, this is another example. It not isn't quite getting at what you're talking about to a certain degree, but it was a woman who was being interviewed, and everybody, the whole search committee, knew her. Because she was very integrated into that particular industry, and they really liked her. And I'll admit, she was a very likable young woman, so I can understand why they were so excited about her. But there was one key thing that she needed to be able to do in this job, and they had even told me early on, the search committee, I asked them, what is a deal breaker? If they don't have this, we know it's just not going to work. Well, she did not have the deal breaker. Yet they kept trying to almost convince her that she could do it. Well, we know you. You'll enjoy it. It'll be easy for you. Don't worry about it. And I could tell she was even getting uncomfortable with all the things that they were telling her. And she finally dropped out. She was their top choice, and she ended up just dropping out. And in conversations with her, some of it, there were other issues, but I sensed it was kind of going back to that search committee wasn't really seeing what was really happening, but someone from the outside sometimes can really see it from a different perspective. And you always want to assume the best of individuals when you're interviewing them, but also when you get a hint of something that doesn't feel quite right, you should really listen to that. And you should spend some time looking at it from other perspectives and seeing, are there other individuals? Do we maybe need to have a few more references and maybe ask specifically around that particular issue? Because we're just sort of sensing something. So even those things that are just maybe not real obvious, but are just giving you an uneasy feeling, don't pass over it, but really dig into it.
That is a great advantage I didn't think about before, of having external search firm looking for a leader, because we have so many biases, and you're right, we know somebody, so we wave them off. And it's and even some churches say we can do it on our own, or we'll just work with the denomination, but that could have a lot of built-in biases. We're just going to do the same thing of how the denomination or the church has done it, and not look for this radical shepherd boy David, who is so out of the box to be the next king of Israel. And that's really fascinating what you say that. It works both ways. When First Pres Honolulu, my former church, was looking for a senior pastor, they did know me. I was the associate pastor. And so because they knew me, they picked somebody else to be the next senior pastor. So I wasn't sure. And the only reason I did become senior pastor was that because their first choice said no.
Oh.
So I was like, all right, let's go back to the bottom of the barrel. Let's have Dad.
Oh, no.
And unfortunately, they got stuck with me for 29 years. But I guess it could work both ways, right? We know you so well, you're not the one. And then it turned out I was the one. But it's
right.
So it goes both ways. But the character thing is interesting, Kathryn, because without naming names, some well-known pastors who did very well in ministry for their first 10 years or more.
Right.
And then we found out, oh my gosh, they had this addiction issue or sexual issue or financial issue that nobody of us knew. And then, of course, boards say, oh, well, we know Pastor so-and-so or President so-and-so. He would never do that. But that was what he was doing.
Right.
And so I'm just trying to think, Kathryn, what is you said character is very important, more important than the platform, but what are some criteria or, litmus paper tests that you do? Maybe it's a one-on-one conversation, not in front of the whole search committee, that you do that says, okay, this is what I'm kind of looking for, and it'll be interesting how they answer on this question. Is there anything, of course you're divulging from everybody your secrets, but is there something you could feel comfortable sharing in what you're kind of trying to detect?
One of the things I look for is how much are they talking about other people? Or are they only talking about themselves and only talking about their accomplishments and, if they're leaving another position, what are they going to most miss about that? And if they talk about things like what they've been able to accomplish there, but never mention other people, for me, that's a red flag. because that's showing me they haven't developed their emotional intelligence enough to a certain point to be able to talk about team members in a way that's very positive, or share their success with other people, or just have enough of a heart for the people that they've worked with to be able to say, I'm really going to miss these people. It's going to be hard for me to walk away from them. I've become so close to them. That's a positive thing for me to be able to hear that and to be able to tell, is that genuine or not? Because for me, that is a sign of real character, of a leader who, you want a leader who truly, genuinely cares about other people.
Hmm. Wow, that's fascinating. And, I relate to that. And of course, when I share the story about relating, it's going to sound like I'm patting myself on the back on your criteria.
Mm.
But people would ask me, what are you going to miss most about leaving the church after 29 years as senior pastor? I was 5 years also as associate. And I said, you know what? My favorite part was having meals with my staff.
Mm.
And we would travel sometimes, and we'd have meals, and we'd laugh, and it was just great meals. And the second thing I'm going to miss is the prayer team. Just working with them, and our church got a little charismatic at some point, and so we were risking, as Presbyterians, we were risking healing, and miraculous healing, and the fear we had, the anxiety we had, the joy we had when people that God did heal them. Those were the two things I would tell people that I would miss the most. So I relate to the team part is very important. It wasn't that by God's grace, God grew our church or anything like that, or we have a
Right.
nice facility. It was these other things that I will miss the most. Is there, this may be hard, but do you feel, either we're more aware of it because of social media, or is there a trend that more pastors, and I'll use the phrase, are falling from grace now than ever before, and what might be causing that? Or are we just knowing more about it because of social media? Because you've talked to a lot of organizations, whether
Yeah.
secular or spiritual.
I think there's got to be a part of it that is just social media. We know more about it. It's much more difficult for that to stay hidden or covered up in some way. It's going to come out eventually because of social media. So I think that is probably part of it. Are we seeing, but is it happening more? I don't know. I honestly don't know. It might feel like it is because we hear about it so much more, but I don't know if it really is happening anymore. I think it's harder to hide than it used to
Mm,
be.
that's true. And there's a sense of me that people are looking more for the Messiah in a human. And so if they
Mm,
have one little problem, let's say, I confess I looked at some pornography the other day. Oh, you're fired. As opposed to, well, this is not a problem to be solved. It's a man who or woman who needs to be loved. And how
right,
do we help that person? But there's a perfection of you're out. Um,
right.
if it's true what Barna says, that 43% of pastors last year's survey want to quit, this year it's 37% of pastors want to quit. And it may mean because 5 or 6% have already quit and resigned. That's why it's lower. What do you attribute that? What is making leadership so hard that even in the church, which would be crippling if we lost 37% of our pastors over the next year or two, what is happening that's making it so hard now than ever?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. One is I think it's always been hard, to be quite honest. Um, I'm counting on my memory here, so hopefully I'll be halfway close. But many years ago, it's now been over 30 years ago, when I worked at Christianity Today, I worked with the magazine Leadership, and we did a study on pastors, and it was about pastors being forced out of their church. And it was, I think, close to around 30% that had been felt as if they had been forced out of their church. So I think that still exists to a certain degree. And there was a lot of other research around this as well, that even in a very large church, it only takes 7 people for someone to feel forced out of their church. So you may have a congregation of 1,000, but it's those 7 people that are very persistent and just make it very difficult for the pastor, and they just finally sort of want to give up and want to walk away. So I think that still goes on a little bit, and I think part of that is related to the world that we live in today that is so divided, and trying to manage and minister within a divided congregation is just an incredibly difficult, thankless task that pastors are faced with on a daily basis. And, coming out of COVID especially, I would hear pastors say things like, well, I'm being told by my congregation I need to take a stand. And the pastor would say, but what they really want me to do is agree with their position. That's the stand they want me to take. They don't want me to take a stand. They want me to agree with them. And you're constantly in a no-win situation as a pastor when you're being forced to pick one side over another on, and the list of issues and topics seems to grow on a daily basis that we're trying to force people on one side or the other. And I think that just really wears on a pastor, and understandably so. And they just get tired of it.
Wow. I never thought about that. And every year, you're right, there are more issues to have an opinion on and take a stand. Presently, when this is being recorded, tariffs is a controversy. Do you support the tariffs or not? And so it's like one more thing, right?
Right.
And then some say, well, we should have a biblical stance on that. Well, what is that? The biblical stance on tariffs, And then you feel like you're... Now, when you said 7, was that due to the survey of Leadership Magazine, or you just said 7? That takes 7 people.
There has been other research outside of Leadership Magazine. We didn't focus so much on the number of people, but once we've started to get a sense for it's a small number, we found other research that had been done where it is a very small number of individuals that really become the problem for the pastor.
Yeah, I know of a friend just recently, I just heard yesterday, who resigned, and I think there are 3 or 4 families that were against him. And but you can imagine, in a large church there's 7, doesn't feel bad, but if we're people-pleasing pastors, that feels bad. But
Right.
if there are only 50 or 100 people in the church and there's 7, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
You just don't feel of much self-worth. And was it Barna or somebody else who said youth pastors, there's only something like 3 to 5% who feel they're flourishing. Well, flipping it, that's 95% at least who are not feel like they're flourishing youth ministry. And maybe they need a lot of affirmation. I spoke to somebody who was a president of a university and now is the president of a high school. And I said, hey, what's the difference? And he said, parents.
Oh.
Because in the university, you don't deal with the parents as much.
Right.
In a high school, why isn't my son the quarterback? Why isn't my son, the president of the student body or something? And he said, that was a big, big difference. I never thought about that. There are more voices.
Right.
And if you're a trustee and you have a kid at the school, oh my gosh, then you have to listen to the trustee.
Right.
Oh, so it seems to me picking a leader today is harder than ever. And yet you are someone who's also into spiritual direction. And there's a big word in the spiritual direction, I don't want to say movement, but study, is that discernment is the word. Right? How do we discern? So this is going to be a tough question, Kathryn. How do we discern God's will in choosing someone who in a human sense may not make sense? And again, I go back to Samuel, the prophet Samuel, in case people don't know, chose shepherd boy David to be the king of Israel.
Right.
And he didn't become king, I think, like till 13 years later. But it was out of the box thinking, and also breaking with what is it called when you favor the oldest son? Primogeniture. That he was the youngest son, or and they didn't go with the older sons, and so that was a cultural taboo that was broken also. So, all right, big question. How do we discern God's choice that may be so different from what the world or what logic may seem?
Right. That is a great question, Dan. And it's one I grapple with almost daily. I'm still on the journey trying to figure out the answer to that question. Some of the things, though, I am discovering are I cannot underestimate or emphasize enough, I should say, the true power of prayer in the process. And if the board and those involved, myself included, if I am not just constantly in prayer and really developing that, my relationship with Christ has got to be at the 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 most intimate I can make it in that moment, because I need to hear. I need to listen and I need to hear, and I'm not going to hear that voice if I'm not constantly in communion and developing that relationship so that that voice becomes very familiar when I do hear it. So I really try to challenge boards, search committees, anyone involved, really commit this to prayer on a very significant basis, because we need to be able to hear that guidance. And the other thing is, as you know, even with we're kind of gone through this with him, is to begin with indifference and to pray for indifference, because we all come to the table with our own ideas of what that person needs to be like, what they need to be able to do, what kind of experience they really need to have. And who knows what other specific details we think that person should really be. And we just need to let that go. Because, as you said, we might be led to someone completely out of the box. And if we're holding that view so tightly, we're not discerning. We're asking for affirmation of our own personal opinion. We're not really allowing God's will to be seen because we're holding so tightly to that. So really, letting that go and being comfortable with that. And exploring what would it look like for this individual to actually be our next leader. What is it about them that's attracting us to them? Why are we being drawn to this individual more so maybe than someone else? Because it is kind of out of the box. What if we were to do that? And just allowing yourselves to kind of go to that place and not to rush to a decision. I had one board. They were so excited about the last person that we interviewed that they literally said, well, are they still here? Can you run down the hall and go get them and bring them back? Because we want to tell them now. And I said, no, he probably is still here, but I think we should all at least go home, sleep on it, pray about it, and then come back tomorrow morning and let me know if you still feel the same way. But they were just so excited. They just wanted to react immediately. And I think that's another part of discernment is we need to pause and slow down and give ourselves the space to really listen and not just get excited. I mean, you should be excited. That's important as well. But pause.
Hey, this is Dan Chun. You know what? If you've heard something that you really like, hit that share button because it would really be a blessing to somebody else. And you know what? The added blessing? It's a blessing to me because it would really help this show. So go ahead, hit that share button. Thanks. That's really great. I mean, I think I'm reading a book now. I think I got this from Mindset by Carol Dweck, D-W-E-C-K or E-K. And she tells a story, and I can't remember if it was Hewlett or Packard, of Hewlett Packard. But once ever a decision was made, let's say it's David Packard, once a decision was made and it was unanimous with the management team, I think Packard would say, okay, we're going to sleep on it. And let's see if there are other things we think of tomorrow after it's ruminated in our minds, like,
right.
Oh, maybe this wouldn't work, or maybe that would work, or this would improve that decision we'd make. And I thought that was fascinating that even a huge billion dollar corporation would say, we're going to put brakes on this and we want to think about this just to make sure that was the wisest decision. And golly, it is so hard. I mean, how do you teach boards to be willing to have the change that they desire in their heart for a new organization?
I'm probably still trying to figure that out a little bit because that is really hard.
Mhm. And
Because
it depends on the board.
it depends on the board, and again, it goes back to a lot of times we say that we want change, but our behavior says something different from that. We're not really supporting the change. Sometimes it's just asking a board, imagine what it would be like if this person would be the leader. Describe it to me. What do you see them doing a year from now? How would the organization be different under their leadership? What could we do as an organization if they were a leader that we couldn't do without them? And just try to ask a lot of questions to get them start imagining what this future could actually be that might be different, and sometimes that can get them excited about possibility.
Wow. So, so hard.
Mm-hmm.
So, if we were to shift a bit,
Mm-hmm.
um, I'm letting you have a free commercial right now. Um, HIM, Hawaiian Islands Ministry, is looking for a new leader.
Mm-hmm.
They've had some founders who, Pam and I, who've been around for 40 plus years, and I know there are many biases out there. Just as you said, we want change, but do we?
Mm-hmm.
A big bias is that the person has to be from Hawaii,
Mm-hmm.
and but maybe that's not God's will. Maybe they're from the continent or
Right.
another country. Who knows? Um, and broadly, what would you want people to know about as we are looking for a founder?
Mm.
I'm sorry, a replacement for the founders of HI. Well, it could be founding a whole new chapter,
Right.
but what would you want to say to make it very clear of what you sense, what the board wants, and what him needs?
Right. I think, one of the words you just used, Dan, is one that I would try to avoid, and that is we aren't looking for a replacement for the founders. Because that's when people start to get hung up and they think, well, we need to find someone just like the founder who can just sort of keep doing what they've been doing. And we're never going to find that because you're unique, as we all are. So that's probably not going to help the organization move forward either. Every organization needs change, especially when a founder is leaving an organization. So I would say, who can do something fresh? Who can take the mission of HIM and take it in a different direction? Doesn't have to be a dramatically different direction, but who can put a fresh spin on it? Who can allow the organization to grow in ways that none of us ever really thought of before? Because they're seeing it with new eyes, new and fresh eyes. And that's what the organization, I think, really needs, is to be able to have that. And again, it's not a criticism whatsoever. I mean, obviously, goodness, 42 years, that speaks for itself in terms of being successful as an organization. But now it's time for something different, and we don't know what that different might be. And allowing ourselves to let God surprise us with something that might be different.
Yeah, and amen to that. And as a founder, I'm looking forward to it. I'm not going to be the one that hovers and be a helicopter founder, and I think it'll be relatively easy for me to let it go, as I've done with my former church. And so it's we do look forward to the fresh wind
Mm.
and fresh fire from the Lord on
Mm.
that. And the same for River of Life, right?
Yeah.
What you said is true for River of Life, a rescue mission to help those who are homeless and disenfranchised.
Right.
Uh, it's time for a new executive director, and I think the board is looking for change, as I'm on the board for that, and they do want God's best for the next
Mhm.
years. Anything you want to say about that?
Yeah, I'll have to admit, I'm still learning about River of Life, but it feels to me like the word that comes to mind is dynamic organization. They've done some amazing things, especially in the recent history. So to me, it's a wonderful opportunity to walk into a situation where you're going to immediately affect a lot of lives in very innovative ways. So some of that innovation has already started. And I think it's a wonderful opportunity for someone to be able to walk into that.
Yeah. And with HIM, it's almost like a blank check. I mean, how do we
Mm,
disciple, renew, build the body of
yeah,
Christ, perhaps create a foundation for renewal or revival in the islands? In what creative way? And there's such open space
right.
for that. Um, and well, Kathryn, this has been so incredibly helpful
Mm,
to hear about this and how we all need to think about whether in a company or in a ministry, how do we select good leaders? And it may not be a top position like CEO. It may be a middle management position. And you do a lot of coaching, don't
mhm,
you? In addition, you have done a lot of coaching
right.
um, for nonprofits and for profits. And before we sign off, what are there any themes that you notice? These seem to be continual themes of where people need guidance in coaching, in managing, or maybe it's managing up, how to respond to a
Mm,
manager. Are there any common themes?
hmm. I think it is managing up and understanding how to really do that and what that means and feeling empowered that you really can do that and do it effectively. I think, nonprofits, I mean, I'm hesitating as I say this one because it hits sort of close to home for me. And that is they struggle to work with their board. That board leader dynamic is really critical, and that hits close to home because I'm a board chair. So I'm always questioning, maybe I'm part of the problem here. How can I truly be helpful? But that relationship um, is really critical. And if you can really make that relationship work between the leader and the board, that is just significant for an organization because you want to be an asset for the leader, not a liability because you're dragging them down. The board really needs to be an asset for them, and they're not always. Absolutely not. I've seen it where they are not. So I think that is one challenge that comes back to me quite frequently.
Wow, that's great. That's great. Um, any final words about leadership that you would hope people would learn? Something that would sink in, that just here's one thing to think about in choosing a leader or being a leader.
One thing to think about. Well, I would say because we are doing this for HIM, I'm just going to say, I would think about what are you doing intentionally to continually grow and build your own spiritual formation. Because I think spiritual formation has to come not just alongside your own leadership development, I think it almost needs to be the precursor to leadership development. And I know that's not the typical perspective in a lot of different situations or from different individuals, but I just feel that more and more when I work with Christian organizations. It all goes back to personal spiritual formation.
That's a great answer because imagine an applicant saying, well, I'm going to dust off my resume and I want to make sure I put all my achievements and my
Mhm.
performance quotient and everything. And then there should be a pause and saying, gee, how's my spiritual temperature right now? How am
Right.
I going in that? Will I have the resilience to
Hmm.
lead this ministry or work in this corporation? And how am I doing spiritually? Or else all things go back to that, especially
Right.
when you're under pressure, under stress, under
Hmm.
failure or success. I remember I had the privilege of interviewing, and people may not know this name. His name is Tom Landry, the former coach for the Dallas Cowboys.
Hmm.
And he said, I couldn't believe it. It was harder for me to be a Christian when I won the Super Bowl
Oh,
than when I
wow.
had all the losses. Because
Mm.
when he had all the losses, and he had terrible seasons, one was like 0 and something, or 2 and 14, or 2 and 12.
Hmm.
And he said, then you fall on your knees and you're close to Jesus.
Yeah.
But when you win the Super Bowl, it can go to your head.
Right.
So, in a sense, if you have a resume with a lot of Super Bowls or playoff wins on it, you can say, look what I've done, as opposed to the Lord was with me.
Right.
And I had the privilege of being on the journey and the adventure with him, and he
Hmm.
did it. So, well, God bless. Thank you so much, Kathryn. This was so helpful, and it's great to have this insight from somebody who's really, chosen a lot of leaders, and you actually nurture them, those who have been selected,
Hmm.
even apart from searches, and that's incredible. So thank you so much, and have a good Chicago hot dog or pizza for us. And we'll see you in Hawaii someday as you continue the search for leaders in Hawaii for ministries.
I look forward to it. Thank you, Dan. It's been a pleasure.
God bless. Aloha.
Aloha.
Hey, this is Dan Chun. Hey, if you really like the show and you want it to keep on going, keep on keeping on, the way it happens is if you could support this ministry. You can go to the HIM website, himonline.org, look for that give button and hit there. And that would really help the sustainability of this show to help others and help you.